Okay, so today we're going to kind of dive into this story. It's about identity and passports and what happens when, like, personal reality and, like, government policy kind of clash. We've got excerpts here from BBC News, CNN, and Forbes, and they're all about Hunter Schafer. You might recognize her. She's the actress from Euphoria.
Oh, yeah.
Um, she had to replace her passport recently because it was stolen. And she was kind of surprised to find that the gender marker on it had been changed to M, even though she identifies as female.
Hmm.
This isn't just like a celebrity story, though. It actually reflects a much bigger policy shift that's been happening under the current administration. And it sparked a lot of debate and even some legal challenges.
Yeah, it really highlights how a passport, which is something we all kind of just take for granted, can become like a flashpoint when you start talking about these larger questions about identity and how it's recognized by the state.
Exactly. So let's start with Schaefer's experience. So she legally changed her gender markers on previous passports and her driver's license years ago. But this new passport, it like reverts back to the sex she was assigned at birth. And there's a detail in the articles that mentioned that her birth certificate was never amended.
Oh, that's a crucial point. It kind of suggests that maybe the original birth certificate played a role in this change. And it also like ties directly into the Trump administration's executive order from 2017 that defines gender strictly as male or female based on sex assigned at birth. What's really significant here is that this order got rid of the X gender marker option. That had been available before.
So what was the reasoning behind that? Like, what need was the X marker fulfilling? And what are, like, the arguments for and against having it on passports?
Well, the X marker is meant to give an option to people who don't identify as strictly male or female, so this includes non-binary, intersex, and gender non-conforming individuals, people who are advocating for the X marker. They argue that it's a matter of accuracy and self-determination. Forcing people to choose a gender marker that doesn't align with their identity can feel really invalidating, and it can actually create practical challenges when they travel. The argument against it usually centers on traditional views of gender and the idea that biological sex should be the only thing that determines legal documentation.
So it sounds like there are some really strong feelings on both sides of this issue. What has the international response been to the U.S. getting rid of the X marker? Have any other countries done the same thing? Or are they moving in a different direction?
It's kind of a mixed bag globally. Some countries like Canada, Australia, and Nepal, they've adopted the X marker or similar options. And others, like Germany, they've introduced a third gender option. So this shows that there's a growing recognition of gender diversity in some parts of the world. However, there's still pushback in other places. And some people argue that these changes undermine traditional values or that they complicate legal systems.
Yeah, it's interesting to see all those different approaches. But going back to Schaefer's situation, what are the potential consequences of this change for her and for other transgender individuals who might be in a similar position?
Well, it could force transgender people to out themselves at border control, which can be really stressful and even dangerous in some countries. It also raises concerns about increased scrutiny and potential discrimination. Schaefer even said that she felt scared about what would happen when this policy was implemented.
Yeah, I can understand why she'd feel that way. Even though she said this change doesn't affect how she sees herself, it sounds like it just adds another layer of complication and anxiety to something that really should be a straightforward process.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Schaefer is a white celebrity trans woman, so she has a certain level of privilege. But her experience brings up a really crucial point about how important visibility and representation are, especially given what Laverne Cox has said about this being the most intense backlash against trans visibility that she's ever seen.
Wow. So what are some of the things that are contributing to this backlash that Cox is talking about?
Well, it's a complex issue. With roots in social, political, and cultural shifts. Part of it stems from a growing awareness of transgender issues, which for some people triggers a sense of fear or like a perceived threat to traditional values. And this can lead to legislative pushback, like the ban on transgender people serving in the military and the restrictions on transgender athletes participating in women's sports.
So is this passport situation just one piece of a much larger puzzle?
Exactly. It all ties into this larger conversation about who has the power to define and regulate gender identity.
What I think is really interesting is that this all started with something that seems so simple, a passport. It's supposed to be this official proof of who you are. But what happens when that very document ends up contradicting your identity?
That's the core of the issue, and it raises some really important questions about the purpose of identity documents in a world where our understanding of gender is becoming more nuanced and fluid.
Yeah, it really makes you think about, like, the assumptions we have about passports and what they're supposed to represent.
Right, like we often think of them as objective truth, but this case shows how they can be subjective and even like politically charged.
So how does Shaker's experience fit into the wider legal landscape? The articles mention that the ACLU filed a lawsuit.
Yeah, the ACLU is challenging the Trump administration's passport policy because they're saying it's discriminatory and that it violates free speech. They argue that it goes against the right to self-identification and that it forces transgender individuals to misrepresent themselves.
What kind of legal precedent are they using to support their case?
Well, they're using cases that have established gender identity as a protected characteristic under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. There's also precedent from other countries that have recognized the right to accurate gender markers on identity documents.
So the outcome of this lawsuit could have major implications for transgender rights in the U.S.
Absolutely. If the ACLU wins, it could force the government to bring back the X marker or to provide other options for gender markers on passports. It would also set a precedent for future legal challenges related to transgender rights.
So it sounds like we're seeing a real turning point in how gender identity is understood and recognized by the law.
Definitely. And it's all happening in the middle of this broader cultural shift with more and more people openly identifying as transgender or non-binary.
But like you said earlier, this visibility has also been met with resistance. Cox's comment about the intense backlash really stuck with me. It's hard to believe that. Such a small part of the population, less than 1% according to the articles, is facing such a strong pushback.
It's really complex, but some people argue that this backlash is just a reaction to perceived social change and a perceived threat to traditional values. Others see it as like fear-mongering or a tactic to distract from other political issues. But no matter what the motivation is, it has real consequences for transgender individuals.
Schafer seems to be very aware of those consequences. Even though she said she's not personally affected by the marker on her passport, she still expressed concern for other people who might not have her platform or resources.
Yeah, it's significant that she's willing to speak out about this. Even with the privilege that she has, it highlights how important it is for allies and people with a platform to use their voice and amplify the concerns of people who are marginalized.
It's a good reminder that even small actions, like sharing a story or speaking up against discrimination, can contribute to larger change.
Absolutely. It's also important to stay informed about the legal challenges like the ACLU lawsuit and how they play out. These cases will have a big impact on the future of transgender rights in the U.S., and they could even set precedents globally.
So this whole conversation started with one person's experience with a passport, and now it's expanded into this much bigger discussion about identity, government overreach, and the fight for equality. It's pretty remarkable how one small event can unpack so much.
Yeah, that's often the case with these deep dives. They remind us that even the most mundane parts of our lives can intersect with much larger social and political forces.
Like you pull on one thread, and this whole tapestry of interconnected ideas and issues unravels.
Exactly. And in this case, that tapestry involves some pretty fundamental questions about what it means to have an identity and how that identity is recognized and respected by the steed.
So for our listener who's been following along, what would you say are the key takeaways here?
Well, I'd say there are three key takeaways. First, political policies have real-world consequences, and those consequences often disproportionately affect marginalized communities. Second, visibility and representation matter, especially for communities facing discrimination and systemic barriers. And third, it's really crucial to stay informed and engage in these conversations because they shape the world we live in.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by these big issues and to feel like there's nothing we can do as individuals. But you're right, staying informed and using our voices however we can is a form of action in itself.
Absolutely. And it's also about staying curious, asking questions, and challenging our own assumptions. This deep dive started with a simple passport, but hopefully it's opened up some new avenues for our listener to explore.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, is there a final thought a lingering question you want to leave our listener with? Something that might spark further reflection or even action.
This whole discussion makes me think. If passports are supposed to be proof of identity, what happens when that identity is contested or denied by official documents? What does that say about the power structures at play and our evolving understanding of gender in society? Those are questions I encourage our listener to ponder.
Yeah, it's a powerful question. And it makes me wonder, what's going to happen to gender markers on passports in the future? Do you think we'll see the U.S. bring back the X marker? Or maybe even move towards a system that goes beyond the binary altogether?
It's hard to say for sure. I think a lot depends on what happens with those legal challenges, like the ACLU lawsuit. And it also depends on, like, the broader conversation about gender identity. But there's definitely a growing movement.
Pushing for more inclusive and accurate representation on identity documents. I'm curious about the practical side of things. Like, if we did move beyond the binary, how would that actually work? Especially when people are traveling to countries that still have that strict male-female system.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. It would definitely require careful consideration and a lot of international collaboration. It might involve creating like standardized systems for recognizing diverse gender identities or even developing new technologies to verify identity that go beyond those traditional markers.
It feels like we're right on the edge of some big changes in how we understand and represent gender. It's exciting to think about the possibilities for creating a more inclusive and equitable future.
It is exciting, and I think it's important to remember that this is an ongoing conversation. It's a process of evolution and learning.
This deep dive has given me a lot to think about. We started with a stolen passport and ended up talking about these really profound questions about identity, human rights, and the role of government.
That's the power of these deep dives. They let us connect seemingly isolated events to these broader currents of social change and to really wrestle with complex questions that are shaping our world.
So for our listener out there, what's the one thing you'd want them to take away from this exploration?
I would say keep questioning, keep learning, and keep engaging in these conversations because in the end, it's through dialogue and empathy and understanding that we create a more just and inclusive world.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.